Hi, Dr. Chipman. I could not figure out how to add audio to a Google Slides. I watched a tutorial on how to do it with GarageBand, and it just was not letting me save it to the Google Drive. So I am taking a video for my narration, and I'm going to send a PDF of the PowerPoint. And if I need to email it in parts, I'll break it up, but hopefully the file can send. So I did my topic on how the Industrial Revolution changed the conversation on climate change. So there are several natural forces over time that have changed the Earth's climate. The natural variability comes from internal and external forces. Some examples that we've talked about in lecture are the El Nino oscillation that moves heat between the atmosphere and the ocean that causes the surface temperatures to vary yearly. We also talked about volcanic eruptions that send particle matter into the atmosphere and can cause cooling from creating a barrier between the sun's energy and the Earth's surface that prevents the sun's energy from getting to the Earth's surface. This mixed with the sunspots can also cause cooling, like how we see with the Little Ice Age. But a point was reached where more needed to be attributed to how the climate was changing besides just natural causes. Human involvement is the other factor, and that being the other influence on climate change started to become acknowledged towards the end of the first Industrial Revolution that occurred in the late 1700s into the early 1800s. This was a time in Europe and the United States where the manufacturing processes shift to large factories that produced large quantities of greenhouse gases being let into the atmosphere, subsequently leading to the warming of the Earth. New technologies during this time, such as the steam engine, released large amounts of smoke into the air that polluted it. When the fossil fuels such as coal and oil get burned, the process combines carbon with oxygen in the air, increasing the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere that warms it. Data for the past 2,000 years show that the atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which are three important long-lived greenhouse gases, have increased sustainability since about 1750, which was right around the Industrial Revolution. Rates of increase in levels of these gases are dramatic. Carbon dioxide, for instance, has never increased more than 300 parts per million during any previous of the 1,000-year period in this record, but has already risen by 30 parts per million in the past 2 decades. These increases in greenhouse gas concentrations and their marked rate of change are largely attributed to human activities since the Industrial Revolution. The increases in current atmospheric levels are the result of competition between the emissions of these gases from human activities and natural systems and their removal from the atmosphere by conversion to different chemical compounds. So like carbon dioxide being removed by photosynthesis and turned into oxygen from plants and other things like that. Then in 1824, as the Industrial Revolution was ending, it led the French mathematician and physicist Joseph Fourier to hypothesize about how the sun's heat gets retained to keep the Earth hot. He concluded that the atmosphere lets radiation from the sun in, but then doesn't let all of it back out. And once that sunlight passes through the atmosphere, the heat is re-radiated down to warm the Earth's surface and the air that's close to above the Earth's surface. John Tyndall, in the start of 1859, he began studying the radiative properties of different gases. He constructed the first ratio spectrophotometer which he used to measure the absorptive powers of gases such as water vapor, carbon dioxide, and hydrocarbons in the ozone. So one of his most important discoveries was the big differences in the abilities of gases and vapors to absorb and transmit radiant heat. Later on, he started to speculate how fluctuations in water vapor and carbon dioxide could then relate to the way that the climate changes. After him was Svante Arrhenius. He published a book based off research done by the other two guys, Fourier and Tyndall, and it described his hothouse theory. So his hothouse theory stated that the Earth's temperature was roughly 30 degrees warmer than it would be due to gases that get contained in the atmosphere. He did calculations that showed if all the carbon dioxide was gone, the temperature would drop around 21 degrees Celsius, which then would make less water vapor. And without that water vapor, it would lead to another 10 degrees dropping. At this time, he wasn't necessarily worried about increasing carbon dioxide levels and how that would impact climate change, but he instead was kind of looking for an explanation for the high temperature climate changes that were happening post the Industrial Revolution. In 1931, an American physicist, Edward Olson Holbert, took a new approach to calculating the global average temperature increase, and it resulted from doubling the atmospheric carbon dioxide level. And that calculation that he created focused on the escape of infrared radiation and an increase in water vapor. An English engineer, Guy Stewart Callendar, comes next. He's most remembered for developing the theory that linked carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere to the global temperature. This theory is very similar to the theory that was proposed by Svante Arrhenius, and so it's now referred to, though, as the Callendar effect. So I'll talk about it later, but one of the things now, there come lots of public health impacts from climate change, and this is what led me to do the research that's at the end of my project. The Great Smog of London in 1952. So with the increased use of coal and the cold and windless winter weather that London was having, there was a crisis known as the Great Smog of London, and it occurred in December of 1952. So for 5 days straight, in the beginning of December, the pollution was so bad that a layer of smog stayed in the air, and it was thick enough to block visibility and to get indoors, and it killed thousands of people. And this event is relevant to my project because it later inspires more investigations between the links of human activities and climate change and crises. Charles David Neeling was an American scientist who did work to measure carbon dioxide levels and detect their annual increases due to the hole in the ozone. He was the first person to alert the world of the seriousness of human contribution to the greenhouse effect and global warming. The measures of progressive buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are now known as the Neeling curve. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is an American scientific agency within the United States Department of Commerce. It focuses on the conditions of the oceans, any major waterways, and the atmosphere, and it was established in 1970 by President Nixon with the intention of better protecting life from natural hazards. So this is when now all these conversations are now starting to lead to action other than just research. The government is starting to get involved more and put programs in place. and that continues in 1978 in response to the hole in the ozone layer. The Toxic Substances Control Act banned commercial use of CFCs and aerosol propellants that were used in hairsprays and deodorants and such in the 70s. Years later, the Clean Air Act addresses the ozone depletion more and created a more broad ban in effort to lessen the harmful pollution. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a part of the United Nations. It was created in 1988 to provide the world with objective scientific information relevant to understanding the risks of human-induced climate change, along with its natural, political, and economic impacts and risks, and the possible response options. And then now we get to another topic that was brought up in class often. So we've entered this geological age called the Anthropocene. This is where human activity has now outweighed the natural causes of climate change, and it's become the dominant influence in the environment. The Industrial Revolution was a big starting point for this because from then on, technology just continuously increased and the land became irresponsibly used with things like deforestation for more infrastructure. After the Industrial Revolution, the increases in greenhouse gases became so drastic that all the influential scientists spent years building off of each other that directly or indirectly led to the knowledge we have on climate change and the programs we've put in place to attempt to get it under control. So then this is what I was talking about, that the smog inspired me to look into a little bit more. So lastly, public health is one of my 3 majors, so I thought finding a way to tie this topic to that would be a helpful way for me to learn more on the topic. So these 4 categories, air pollution, water pollution, vector-borne disease, and natural disasters seem to be the best way for me to categorize and summarize kind of everything I found. Air pollution from climate change leads to kind of obvious problems. You get more cases of asthma, and depending on what the inhalants are, it can lead to issues beyond just respiratory. Air pollution is responsible for about 2 million premature deaths worldwide. Water pollution leads to major sanitation issues that can lead to waterborne diseases and diarrheal diseases. UNICEF reported 783 million people do not have access to clean drinking water, and that is a major public health crisis. Increase in temperature can increase the biting, survival, and reproductive rates of vectors and the pathogens that they carry, and changes in precipitation can aid in the aquatic development stages of vectors or give them more suitable humidity. Vectors like mosquitoes have an aquatic development stage, and then vectors that don't have one, like ticks, they still do better in the humid climates. So when climate change has those impacts on areas, places that may not have had as big of a vector-borne disease problem in that area or had one under control, it can reemerge it. Every year, 1 billion people get infected with vector-borne disease, and some of them, such as dengue fever, get worse every time you get it. Drastic temperature changes also cause more drastic natural disasters, and not only does it make more intense hurricanes or forest fires or any of them, that leads to obvious public health impacts like burns, cuts, bruises, infections. There also has been increased patterns of suicide after these events that are assumed to be linked to like the stress of displacement from a natural disaster, the trauma of going through the event, or the grief of what you've lost from it. And that doesn't even begin to touch onto the way that these things impact economies and healthcare facilities being overwhelmed. So these are my references. In conclusion, the Industrial Revolution was just a huge turning point in the way that humans impacted the environment, and it led to a necessary and slowly progressed conversation about climate change and all the impacts that come with it. And then I just kind of tried to put my own spin on things and learn more about it by tying it to public health. I'm sorry about how awkwardly this is filmed, but it's getting late and I was really struggling to get audio into it. Okay, thank you.